Okay, so in continuing with Unit 12, where we're designing type and then using that type in a full poster layout, we're using the term design here in the most appropriate way. Design is a field of visual art where you are meant as the artist to solve problems. And the problems are usually already set out for you. So in terms of poster design, one problem that's always set out for you is the format. So if we look up standard poster format, these are the physical dimensions, right? The physical format. And you'll see that the most popular are ratios of 2:3 and 4:3. So what does this mean? It's what we call A2 format, A3 format, and A4 format, right? So this is what most posters are designed in. We're going to be designing in an A2 format, which works best internationally, and that is 16 by 20 inches. Now that can be 16 by 20 inches where it's taller than it is wide, which you would say 16 by 20 because you usually say the horizontal measurement first, or it can be 20 by 16 inches, which is landscape format, wider than it is tall. The next standard is what's called B2 for posters, and that's 18 by 24 inches. But we can't print that large in this lab, so we do 16 by 20 so that we are able to make the best prints. So what is our format going to be, our digital format? It's going to be a PSD file with vector type with a PNG of our best colored spot illustration in there. So we'll have vectors, we'll have raster, and we're going to do it on a 16 by 20 format, either horizontal or vertical, at 300 pixels per inch. We're going to work on it today. We're going to work on it next class. It's due on November 13th. November 13th is also when our student presentations start. So that's one of our other reminders for today, to claim your individual presentation digital artist. Now, we just watched the Papyrus SNL skit, right, which I recommend. Just search Papyrus SNL to be reminded how important it is to not just be arbitrary with your type. So we've spent a lot of time and care making our spot illustrations. And so now with this project, we need to think of how to design the text that goes around them. And not only designing that text, but deciding what it is we want that text to say, right? So the way to do this that I mentioned in the intro in the last video is with what's called a text blocking or type blocking sketch. And when you sketch with type blocking, like I have shown on the whiteboard, you don't really worry about the individual letter design. You worry about the shape you want the type to take up. So if you want it to be, a horizontal and vertical banner, if you want it to be curved, if you want it to be angled, if you want it to feel more mechanical or more organic, if you want it vertical or horizontal, if you want it skewed or straight, if you want the heights to vary or for all the heights to line up with each other. So as we're designing this, the first step before we get into the individual letter design, the individual kerning and letting the spacing between the letters, we have to think of the type we want, right? And then block it out. So this is what I started showing you last class, but I can improve upon this, right? I can think about the shapes that I want the type to fulfill and what those shapes are doing. So I think this banner is a little weak, and I think I want to play with it with a little bit more strength. And this is some inspiration that shows some beautiful just design with type, using up the space, using the shapes of the type to engage the eye, and then within those shapes using the actual type design, whether they're serif typefaces, whether they're modern typefaces, this has both, whether they're Gothic typefaces, this has everything in it except script typeface. It can be very effective. So inspired by that, let's continue our demo This is assignment 6. It's unit 12. And one of the options we'll have, just like that Papyrus video talks about with the avatar logo, is we can take existing typefaces and modify them for our purposes. But we want to make sure that they're our own creation. So this is what the PSD I was working on last class, just roughly sketching over my spot illustration, right? I'm going to do it in a new way, because that's what basic text blocking is. But this time, I'm going to go back to my assignment 5 and find my best, most finished one, which had CMYK color separation in it. And what I'm going to do is open a new Photoshop file, and I'm going to make it a new format, which is 20 inches wide, because I'm going to go a landscape format by 16 inches tall by 300, professional minimum print standard. Why is it not taking any of these? There we go. So 16 inches tall, 20 inches wide. And all of our posters, the problem you have to solve is to make the most engaging combination of image, text, and background and border on that same format of 16 by 20. It's an A2 format. And this is kind of an international standard for versatile poster design. Works for mailings, works for flyers, works for promotional images. It can be modified slightly to work well for social media and for online campaigns as well. Okay, now I'm going to drag and drop my best spot illustration. And if you're still working to create your best colored spot illustration, you're empowered to do that, right? And now I'm going to place it, and I can immediately start solving another design problem for this, which is the border. So what I'm going to do is duplicate the background and then fill it, edit fill, with middle gray, like we did when we were coloring. And then I'm going to hit Command T to free transform and hold down Option while I shrink that to decide on the width of the border that I want. So I'm going to have a pretty thin border on this. Then I can hold down Shift and Option and even that border out. But in order to design type effectively, like to really take this text blocking seriously, you want to think about the space you have to operate with, right? And if you need more space for your ideas for type, then you're going to shrink your spot illustration, right? You're going to transform that and place it a little bit differently. So now I have a background, right? I have a border. Everyone's border is going to be white. I have my spot illustration. I'm going to lock these things. And I'm going to create a new layer on top. And this is the text blocking. And my idea was to text block here to add a big I. Now, that is not my I design. That is the visual space I want that letter to take up. And then to visually design a D. So that's the block that will take up. I think it'd be interesting if instead of it just being the same height as the E, it could be a little bit bigger to kind of bring the I movement around. And then on the bottom, I wanted to do something that I was hoping would feel sarcastic and supportive at the same time, even though this is my optimistic poster, right? Is to say you're welcome. And maybe even have that break the border a little bit. So let's see. So this is what's called a banner block. So a block is the space that the text takes up, but I want it wider at the front or taller at the front than it is at the end. Now the beauty of text blocking digitally is you can easily make little changes to these, even before you think of how the type will fit within them. So how can I do that? Well, I can just Command T and stretch. So if I wanted to even out side to side a little bit, I can make it a little bit bigger. If I want to, I can hold down Shift and I can stretch it taller. If I want that banner at the bottom to have more space, I can right click and warp within it. All these transform tools we used when we were compositing, right, can be useful here. Until just the shapes themselves feel like they're telling the story I want. Okay, so that looks pretty good. And then that shows me that I might want to move up my spot illustration a little bit. And maybe even move it over a little bit. Maybe even shrink it a tiny bit. And now all of these are going to be components that can change with our layout. By dragging and dropping our PNG in, our most finished PNG, and then saving this as a PSD, we keep it as a smart object. It will always be perfectly clean at whatever resolution we choose, as long as that resolution is lower than or equal to what we designed it to be, right? All right, so now I'm just going to work with this banner to get it a little bit closer to what I want. And I'm using a tablet to draw these shapes. You can also draw this by hand. And I do Command T and right click and warp. And now I can make it a little bit cleaner. And what I'm trying to avoid, this is a really common problem with layout and design, are what are called tangencies. And I've used that term a few times in past videos. I've used it on critiques of your work. And that's where you want to avoid uncomfortable touching, right? Things that are like uncomfortably close to each other. So if this was moved up just a little bit, even though it's separate, that feels uncomfortably close. So it causes an unintentional focal point. Now, sometimes you want tangencies in your design to cause discomfort, like we saw with the Stranger Things type design, right? They take something like this standard typeface, right, that blocks itself out with a certain kerning that's pretty tight and very readable, and then they intentionally shrink it so that they become even more uncomfortable, like between the N and the G. So the G actually has to flatten out at the back. So this is imitating it with, a found typeface, but this is customized. This is modified, maybe started with a typeface, but the actual, official typeface is customized to heighten that tension, those tangencies. But I don't want this to feel like a horror movie poster, right? I want this to feel more uplifting, so I try to avoid those tangencies. And there's a few ways. I could do it that way. I could also, by giving everything its space, I could also simply put that banner overlapping my illustration. And a lot of you might choose that solution. So instead of putting it on the top of, on the side of, underneath, you can actually have it overlap, right? And that's another way of avoiding that tangency. And that might be an interesting solution. So I'm going to keep that as an alternative. Okay, so what's next? I've blocked it out. Now the next step of text blocking is to separate out the different letter forms you need. So here I just need one, and I'm just going to carve those letters out, and I'll do it in a different color so you can see it clearly. So here, it's going to be pretty simple. I just need a big capital I. I don't want it to be too eye-catching, but I'm going to use serifs on it. Serifs are kind of the decorative ends on a letter form. Even though this is what's called a modern typeface that I drew for the vote, it doesn't have any serifs on it.